When hearing the national park or national forest, one would think of vast areas still completely vegetated and practically untouched by man. It is a place that is still primitive and original to the way the earth once was. So hearing National Park Service gives a lot of people an illusion or idea that they are responsible for protecting, preserving, and keeping the parks and forests in the original primitive state. What the Forest Service does is build roads. I'm not kidding. There are 378,000 miles of roads in America's national forest. That is 8 times the total mileage of America's interstate highway system, according to Bill Bryson in his book A Walk in the Woods. The National Park Service, or NPS, spends money and effort in recreational and constructive things such as roads, campsites, campgrounds, and so on. Their reason for doing so is to make it more accessible and comfortable for people to enjoy the national parks and national forests. By looking at the ecosystems of the forest, park preservation, the National Park Mission Statement, and their goals, and the NPS funding, we can determine if the National Park Service spends enough of their funds and attention on preserving species of plants and animals, and this will help us understand why the Park Service spends their money in other areas. The complexity of preservation and man's continuous effect on it makes it difficult to determine if the park systems are able to use their funding to preserve ecosystems in a self-contained way. Douglas B. Houston, a chancellor at Yuba Community College, argues in his article, Ecosystems of National Parks, that the goal of the park system should be able to maintain an ecosystem that limits disruptive and consumptive intervention from man. Houston claims criteria for management of park ecosystems must, of necessity, differ from the criteria for the other uses of land, since park management involves preventing or compensating for the influence of man. This would mean that the park systems have to be more sensitive in their use of funds in order to control the variables that man's interaction with land causes. When the park systems recognize that the ecosystem has a finite capacity for recreation, then perhaps the funding can be more carefully invested in the preservation of the land as opposed to the exposure of the environment. The park systems use funding to help the ecosystem by providing ample resources for wildlife to grow and pristine consistent without disruption. Then this has the potential to conflict with the consistent support of the tourism throughout national parks. In addition to Houston's observations about ecological mindfulness, David Parsons, the Institute Director for Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, discusses that to preserve the ecosystems of the parks, we need a better understanding about population, community, and the ecological process. Parsons explains that although much excellent science was conducted in the national parks between the 1970s and the early 1990s, continued concern over inadequate funding, disagreement about how research should be organized within the agency, and a reluctancy to fully incorporate science into management decisions led to an additional external reviews of the NPS science. These additional reviews showed the mass concern that has already been expressed over the decades about park funding. Even though there are conflicting biases about where the funding should go, it is evident that the scientific research has been questioned by the public and private parties due to the underwhelming amount of biological research and contributed to fiscal decisions. In order to combat this lack of education, NPS Director Robert Stanton announced a major new initiative in 1999 to address the natural resource management challenges facing the agency. This initiative would address issues such as non-native species, endangered species, and air and water quality concerns. In 2000, Congress funded this initiative known as the Natural Resources Challenge and provided 14.3 million of the requested funding. As awareness increased, more programs with private and public pushed for accessibility for scientists to continue research in the national parks. Although Congress has funded many initiatives, the National Resources Challenge being one, it is still difficult to cultivate an understanding of how natural processes can exist with human interaction. The mission statement of the National Park Service reads, "The National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world." The statement serves as a primary example of how the NPS defines themselves as an agency and their goals. The statement is broad and somewhat nondescriptive. The NPS includes extending the benefits of natural and cultural resources conservation, but does not specifically address the conservation as the goal, but rather that the sharing of this conservation as the priority. In the article Mission Rivalry, Use and Preservation Conflicts in the National Parks Policy, written by Shannon Orr and Rebecca Humphreys, they argue that the national park should have a complicated mission and that the relationship with tourism prevents the statement from being cohesive and including both outdoor enthusiasts and so-called windshield visitors. The mission statement becomes an important determinant of how the NPS uses language to try and realize all the expectations the public has for the national parks. Orr and Humphrey would argue that the mission statement does not accomplish this unification of ideas in the organization that failed to articulate the shared interests of their stakeholders within their mission statement possesses mission rivalry. They analyze how a mission statement should be put together and explain what was lacking. The fact that the statement is contradictory to itself and non-descriptive because of the tourism aspect is what makes it difficult to know the functionality of the NPS. Along with Orr and Humphrey not being able to determine the true duties of the NPS, other people have struggled as well. John Lemons, coordinator for the Division of Environmental and Biological Studies at New England College, and Dean Stout, attorney, say in their article, National Parks Legislative Mandate in the United States of America, the law that created the NPS in the mission statement is misinterpreted. The problem arose from the heavy traffic of visitors of the years. The influx of people resulted into visitors having different expectations of what the park should be, and the Park Service is attempting to resolve complex issues in order to mitigate threats. These issues include determination of appropriate use of particular areas of facilities which are necessary or as opposed to merely convenient implementations, which should be placed on numbers of visitors or vehicles and of standards of comfort and aesthetics which are appropriate for park facilities. From construction of facilities and high visitation numbers, the preservation and health of the forest is at stake. Lemons and Stout analyzed the laws created by the Congress for the NPS to interpret to resolve the issue of preservation versus development. In the traditional interpretation, it was seen that the focus to be preservation and use and maximize each equally. However, more and more visitors shifted the focus to use. It wasn't until the 60s that the reality of the irreparable damage was happening to the park. This led to the second interpretation by Lemons and Stout. Their interpretation is that the most basic duties of the Park Service are to minimize development and maximize preservation of resources. The conclusion of their report is that no park is immune to major threats resulting from visitor use and facilities within the park, and that there is no question that the threats will continue to degrade and destroy irreplaceable park resources until such a time as mitigation measures are implemented. The Park Service budget today is $200 million a year less than it was a decade ago. The National Park Service website allows everyone to see the yearly budget and funding. There is even a list of parts of the budget that got adjusted or didn't pass for funding. The discretionary funding for the 2014 budget was $2,559,519. Once studied, it is surprisingly exactly where the money goes. Setting a budget sheet for the NPS, it is clear to see that the majority of the budget goes to operation, recreation, and construction. The rest of it does go to various forms of preservation and maintenance of land. At the same time, if the studying past budgets to present the funding is slipping away, the NPS themselves have no control over that, but it comes from Congress. The National Park Service themselves have done damage. Bryson, in A Walk in the Woods, tells a story about the Park Service in 1957 trying to reclaim Abrams Creek back from rainbow trout. To do so, biologists dumped several drums of poison into 15 miles of creek. After several hours, thousands of dead fish floated to the surface. They swiped out 31 species of fish, some of which had never been seen before. The National Park Service has also done wonders in preservation, in instances of burning forests for new vegetation or fighting back fires like that of the Yellowstone fires in 1988. The NPS also has increased number of visitors miraculously and rather fast. Number of visitors are jumping from 177 million in 2010 to 200 million in 2014. By understanding park preservations, the science of it, and how the NPS is done with preservation, and comparing that to their funding, mission statements, their usage, it is easy to determine that if the National Park Service spends enough of their funds and attention on preserving species of plants and animals,